Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Leading in a Crisis podcast. On this podcast, we share stories from the front lines of crisis communications. We deliver this through interviews, storytelling, and lessons learned shared from experienced crisis leaders. I'm Tom Mueller. If you'd like to email the show, you can drop me a line at tom@leadinginacrisis.com, and we'd love to hear from you. So our guest today is James Hartsfield, a veteran communications professional who worked much of his career at NASA's Johnson Space Center here in Houston. James, welcome to the show.
Hey, Tom.
So James, that was some pretty, horrific times there. What else do you remember about, your after actions on after Columbia?
So that first week, we had the press conferences in Houston, and the primary release of information was really from the shuttle program management. They also had a press conference from Washington, but it was kind of a secondary to the Houston one, which was giving out really all the information. It was just at the venue of Washington. They felt required one because of all the news networks headquartered there. But of course, we had hundreds of media that converged on Houston and were there, at the press conferences. But after a week, the Columbia Accident Investigation Board had been formed, that was part of the plan for NASA to form an investigation board that was developed after Challenger. And when they were formed, they really took over communications, right? Because, and I agree, it would have been inappropriate for NASA to independently be giving out information about findings from the accident. And NASA was being, subject to the investigation, right? So we did not provide information unless requested by the board to do something, or we asked some special permission to it. There was a NASA public affairs person that helped support the board. So they didn't do a lot of press conferences. They kept communications fairly minimal too, but that was okay at that point because I think, like I said, the first impressions and the openness had been set early in the first week. People understood the investigation taking place. A couple of other things on that first week I will mention is as my reintroduction to NASA had been in the first place much earlier, right after Challenger, where I went to the memorial service that Ronald Reagan had at Houston. There was a similar memorial service held after Columbia that the President Bush came to and headed. And on that day, I lobbied very hard that we don't do a press conference in Houston, which everyone agreed with, because it just was not appropriate, right? That was a day for the memorial. And so we didn't do a press conference that day. And then the other thing I want to say is that I worked with, I don't know, probably a half a dozen shuttle program managers over the years I was at NASA. Probably the closest person I had ever worked with, and this was prior to Columbia, that I had the best working relationship was the program manager during Columbia, Ron Dittemore. But I'd been working with him for a couple of years before the accident, through a lot of shuttle missions, doing a lot of talking points and these kind of things. But had a really good working relationship, a good trust established. That's critical. I think to have trust established with your leadership, between communications and leadership, a person. I mean, I'm sure you can get through a crisis without it, but boy, it's a hard place to build that trust and that belief in competency during a crisis. You go into a crisis with that, it's much better. And I will say the same about the media. NASA's relationship with the media goes back and forth. It had gone back and forth many times over even small shuttle flights or issues that had happened between Challenger and Columbia as to whether we were being forthcoming and straightforward and answering things. There was at times now and then, they use NASA as an acronym for never a straight answer, NASA, So sometimes it wasn't that great, but it was good at the time. And so, that's critical because you're not gonna, you want to preserve your integrity and your credibility in a crisis with all forms of media and all the audiences you're communicating with, your employees, first and foremost, your stakeholders, elected officials, and the media and the public. So you want to maintain your integrity, but are you going to build integrity and credibility during that time? Probably not. You'd be best to go into that time with some level of credibility and integrity. If you're going into that time with already a big shadow of doubt hanging over you in terms of your transparency, you're going to have order of magnitude more difficulty in the situation.
Absolutely.
So we were fortunate to have that at the time, and that helped a lot. And then one more thing, before we get out of Columbia here, is that the crisis, of communications, right? And eventually the Columbia Accident Investigation Board found that the foam had hit the wing and that had improved it through testing that they did out in San Antonio. Still remember when the first test happened that actually shattered that reinforced carbon-to-carbon. It was just a jaw-dropping moment. I'd gone to some of the testing out there, had seen it, and I got that call that had occurred. That was a jaw-dropping moment to see that could actually occur. And then, the plan was made, how are we going to return the shuttle to flight? Which was, we were not flying for several years after Columbia. And then we developed a plan where NASA developed a plan. It could inspect the heat shield. It could do some repairs on the heat shield if needed. The foam, we tried to stop the foam from coming off the tank, although that's really almost impossibility to do. We did do a lot to keep the gas, which got underneath it and levered it off to stop that from happening. So we felt we resolved a lot of it, improved the imagery. I think all of those things returned to flight safely. We said we wouldn't fly anywhere but the station so that the crew had a way, if there was damage, that they didn't have to return on the shuttle. They could stay on the station and return in another fashion. All of those things were precautions to return to flight. And that crisis communications was not resolved until we had returned to flight, right? Eileen Collins flew the first shuttle after Columbia, STS-114, and we had a huge plan as we got ready for that mission and in that interim, I got promoted into management, by the way, kind of a battlefield promotion. So I quit doing anything fun after that. Not really, because I love management and the things that came with that we can talk about later. But certainly was instrumental in planning for that return to flight and how we would do the media. We had workshops where hands-on the crew of STS-114, Eileen Collins and crew, could show the media what we had done and what we were doing differently with the shuttle, and the precautions that had put in place. And that was really beneficial, right? I learned that over my time at NASA, that if you can have the media actually come in and hands-on participate and talk to the astronauts and see the equipment and touch the equipment that we're doing, then in the crunch, when things happen, if they don't work well or if they do work well, the media are going to understand it way better and they're going to report it way better. It's going to be more accurate. So that the crisis doesn't end until you're, I guess, back in operation and people agree that you've resolved all the issues.
Yeah, it's just such a long wavelength situation there, and getting back to space was a huge issue. And James, now you had transitioned, as you said, into management. I want to kind of ask you about hiring people and what you look for, but just quickly, is there anything else on crisis exercises that you like to highlight? You mentioned the simulations and what you do. Is there any other type of exercises that you do?
On practice, I'll say that, and there's separate things, right? And I don't know how to equate these to everyone else's situation outside of NASA, because NASA's so unique on a lot of things. Spaceflight, obviously, that's one of the most amazing things about working there, right? Is the uniqueness. But there's the practice of learning crisis communications in mission control, doing the commentary, as we talked about, the voice of mission control, and learning how to do that. Here's a little story I'll tell you, is that when I did get hired, they called me, Jack Riley, the voice of Apollo, called me back and I got hired, and I went in, and there's a thing that happens. You come in and they said, we're hiring you, but it's going to be 2 months before you can start because the budget comes in then or something. So I had 2 months before that, and I made the mistake of saying, well, hey, is there anything I can do to help get ready to hit the ground running? And they handed me an 800-page book on the space shuttle systems. Wow. And said, yes, you could read this and learn it.
Wow.
And I said, wow. And I did though. Over the next 2 months, I took it down and I sat on the beach a lot reading that 800-page book, which was a real Bible about the shuttle and its systems. But that's just in a nutshell to illustrate that there's that one part of the crisis communications is learning, whether it's your plant or your refinery or whatever it is, how does it operate? What does it create? How does it work? Where are the points that are issues and not issues? What happens when these things break? Because in a real-time situation, you're not always going to be able to go ask what that is. Now, in practice situations, you can. There's a practice, then afterward, you can have a debrief, and you can have your own debrief where you go find the right technical expert and find out all about that, right, and learn it. But you're not going to always have that in a real-time situation. So learning that's what the console part was. The second part is really that having leadership side by side with you, really devoted to participating in that exercise and finding somebody, because it might not be you that wants to do it. The sim soups were good for it, right? Because they were supposed to do that. That was their job. But somebody who can tell leadership that if they screw up in that practice simulation, that, leadership, you screwed up. That's not a good thing to do. Might have to draw short straws to figure out who's going to do that, right? But maybe an outside person to come do that is good, right? But they need to have that objectivity. You have to be able to tell them that. Leaders don't want to. I think by and large they understand that this is not their expert area and they want to work with it. But you need that, and you need to build that strength of relationship. And I think the practice sessions do that on those two levels, right? Because one, if you are on that first level where you understand the equipment and the processes and the technical areas, if you understand them enough, you're never going to be an engineer. You just profess to be a technical expert. That's not your field, but you understand them enough. It gains you respect with the other leadership, right? That is in the technical area, that you have done your homework to learn it, right? And that's exactly the way it is at NASA. You get more respect because you do understand some of these systems,
Yeah. And it makes you a better commentator and PAO because you can talk coherently about what's happening.
Absolutely. And I will tell you too, I think NASA, I've always had the opinion that NASA, because we operate on the edge of technology and the edge of achievement, if we can just get the public to accurately understand what we're doing and accurately understand what has caused a problem, then they'll give us the empathy required, the leeway, the bandwidth, because lots of times space is just not easy to explain, And I said, well, I'll go back to with Columbia is the lightweight foam, marshmallow weight foam of a 10-foot section. But once it came loose from that large orange external tank, it was only 100 so feet, a couple hundred feet above the wing, the leading edge wing. But it came loose, and the shuttle is accelerating so fast, it goes from 0 to 17 times the speed of a rifle bullet in 8 minutes. It's accelerating so fast during that time frame that the foam came loose. The shuttle is accelerating. The foam is decelerating immensely because of the air resistance that it's hitting. It's a low density foam. The shuttle wing is accelerating. So by the time it hits the wing, there's a difference in velocity of 1,000 miles an hour or so. And so this marshmallow weight piece of foam is now a bowling ball going at a high velocity, hitting this reinforced carbon-carbon. Hindsight, the kinetic energy issue there, it's easy to see. And that's, that's the damage that was easy to see. But I will go into hindsight. I'm going to say my one thing about hindsight because it's a favorite of mine is hindsight is a wonderful, wonderful teaching tool, wonderful educational opportunity. It's a horrible yardstick. You should never, if you're going to measure the performance of people who are doing things in real time because of your hindsight, your measurements are usually going to be wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's wild. So yeah, it can be a brutal yardstick because you think back on
It's usually used as a yardstick, unfortunately, and it shouldn't be. It should be used as a teaching tool, an educational opportunity. Maybe there's some uses of a yardstick, but most of the time you see it pulled out as a yardstick, and that's not good. It's not usually accurate.
Yeah. Now, James, the Columbia thing that you worked really was before we had all these social media channels out there today. Has How is the sort of planning adjusted with social media, and is that getting incorporated actively into your response these days?
I mean, our responses for social media now, I think it's pretty standard, right? We don't put out any social media. Everything goes and starts following message, constrained, on what we're putting out. We're not going to do any of our normal in a real contingency crisis. It would be inappropriate to be doing anything else, and everything stays following. Which is one of my things I say about crises too, is you tell all audiences the same thing. A lot of times you'll see an entity try to tell different things to different people in a crisis, right? They'll tell their employees something, they'll tell the media something, they'll tell Congress something else. They'll put on different channels, they'll put different things, or they just can't control all their channels. I don't know why, but that goes right to the heart of the integrity issue and the credibility. It's going to tear it up, because what's right? Why are they saying this? Now, I give some deference to, they want to tell the workforce first things, and I think that's appropriate. I see that, and I think that's a good thing that they want to do that. Fortunately, it's just not very workable sometimes in a contingency. If you're going to do that, do it by a matter of minutes. Don't do it by days, or try to. And it's another thing we used to talk about in the old days. We used to talk about news cycles, right?
Right.
It's all one big news cycle now. It's going every second of every day of every hour of every day of the week.
And it's
So
public immediately now.
yes,
Even internal communications are just public
I
instantly.
think more so social media. For one thing, I would say this a lot, is that the ways to deliver communications have changed, but the things that people are interested in don't change, and that's mainly other people, in my opinion. Mostly people are interested in other people. That's really what they're mostly interested in. Even if you're going to space, you can fly an uncrewed spacecraft and there'll be some level of interest, but when you fly people around the moon, whole different story,
Yeah.
and that you can tell them about the systems on the spacecraft and the technology and all this stuff, but really seeing that person have to eat in space is gonna be more interesting to them than anything else, So people are I'll go back to our newspaper days, Tom. I've always carried this with me, because a certain editor that we both had, I told him, I had photography, I've worked on photography, but I'm not the best photographer. And he said, it's okay. What you really need to remember when you're going to shoot a picture, try to make sure that you have the person's face. If it's going to go in the paper, their face is at least as big as a quarter. It's big enough that they can see the expressions and what's on the person's face, because that's all anybody wants to see mostly in the picture is the faces. And I'm using that as an analogy to a bigger thing. That's what they really are interested in, is people, all the time, right?
Right.
I don't know if you got that same lecture, right? But it was
Yeah, I mean, it's the human impacts
yes,
on things, right? And that's
yeah,
what one of the definitions of a crisis is, that it affects people. And that's where the empathy is so important, that you recognize you've had an effect on people, acknowledge that, now tell them what you're doing about it, right? And be as transparent as you can. I think that's terrific advice.
And the other thing I'll say about social media and media in general, right, that has changed, and I lament some on, is that NASA, in the first when I was there early in the career and moving on, and I think it may be coming back to this with Artemis. I think it's that may start shifting things, but we had a dedicated number of media, from major outlets, wire services, newspapers, networks, that only focused on space. They had a reporter assigned to cover space, and so that reporter learned. They read that 800-page shuttle book. Maybe they didn't go that far, but they learned a lot about the system. So they were inevitably way more accurate in their reporting. So when a mainstream media, general media that didn't always cover us, came in and did one thing that sensationalized it but wasn't accurate, their stories would outweigh that with the accurate version. And they were always a good outlet for us to go to make sure the accuracy was coming. that disappeared,
Hmm.
and there's very, yes, I think it's not a stretch to say there's very little standard that the media holds these days for accuracy or objectivity. They found ways that they can make more money by being subjective than rather than objective, and
Well,
and so that's pushing them, and that's true in social media, that's true in print, broadcast, wherever. So that to me, even more so than social media, that's the bigger change you have to deal with. You have to figure out how to deal with that.
the
But I'll still
immediacy.
say the best way to deal with that is just to stick to your guns and report the accurate measures. You can go try to fight a brush fire and correct them, but the saying is like you don't want to fight a person who has an endless supply of ink, right? Because they'll win in the end. They can keep going.
Yeah.
So try to find people that will put out the accurate story. Stick to your guns. Keep putting out the right stories. I think that's the best defense.
Yeah, and I agree with that completely. But you got to have a machine ready to crank that information out, right, and get it to the right reporters. And the social media aspects today just create so much chaos around communications. The AI pieces, how you can create a fake video, just like that. And
And
now you've got to track those down or be able to refute a fake video.
well, I'm going to fault the audience here some too, right? Because the audience, and I'm hoping they get smarter. I'm hoping AI will make the eye in the audience better. The intelligence of the audience a little bit better, because I fault them now that it comes across your social media feed and it looks cool, and they don't bother to try to figure out whether it's real or not. They just take it and they go with it, and they don't, and a lot of them don't seek news anywhere else. They just see it on social media and they take it, and that's a tough situation. An audience of that type is very hard to reach. You need to put out your own, but a lot of times, in fact most of the time, the truth is way more boring than a deep fake.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And you've got to get your management comfortable with going out on TikTok or Instagram or, these places where a lot of those viewers are living today. And a lot of companies just aren't really comfortable with that.
Well, I would say a little of that goes to the battling the person with the endless supply ink too. You go fight them in their home territory. Sometimes you still lose.
Hmm.
I think management also needs to get comfortable with not battening down the hatches, keeping putting out their material, put it out on social media, put it out on regular media, and telling your truth, and then weathering the storm. Because sometimes management doesn't want to weather the storm and they want to be too proactive. I've run into that. I mean, you seem like you're giving me a little bit different thing of they don't want to be proactive, but there's a such thing as being too proactive too, right? There's a sweet spot in there.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's more a matter of you've got your messages. Now, how are you going to deliver those messages, right? And 20 years ago, you'd get it to, Miles over at CNN or whoever the space reporter was at NBC News, and you'd get a good trickle-on effect from that. But now, TikTok is where most people are getting their news from. So, are you comfortable creating TikTok videos in this situation? So it's just, it's a bit of a chaotic media
But
environment.
here's the issue, Tom. You create a TikTok video and it's probably not going to be as engaging as a lie is.
Mhm.
That's the problem. So you don't see it if it's not engaging. But I do think, and what does happen, right, is there will be entities that come to you to check the veracity of things that are on social media, and those might be other social media areas or this kind of thing. I have faith. I have faith that no matter the format of media, the story is always the same. It's the ways you can tell it, the formats that are out there that allow you to tell it in social media or broadcast or print or what multimedia now. They allow you to do different things with it, but I have faith that it all circles back around. This phase we're in right now of AI and it's not a phase. I think AI is here to stay, but the deep fakes and these kind of things that are happening in the way social media goes like that, I think every time one of those happens, the audience gets a little more educated. They do. Even the TikTok, voracious TikTok users do. And that will come around and counterbalances will occur and start to happen in the media more.
You are
A bigger
keeping the
issue is the
faith here,
lack of
James.
any desire by a lot of media to be objective. I I think I think an objective media needs to really be important, but unfortunately, the profit motives don't really support that. I don't think. I don't think an objective media is going to be the most profitable media these days. If you
Right.
can take a side, then you're more profitable. So that's a bigger issue. But that also, I think, over time, it just takes time for the counterbalances to start to hit. I think, and the main counterbalance is a better educated audience, and every time the media goes off tangent and goes to something that leads the audience astray in the end, the audience learns.
You give us a lot of faith, James. I'm happy to
Well,
hear
I try
that.
to look at the bright spots on it, man. I don't know.
And I hope that's true because I feel like we're getting dumber and dumber as time goes by, and AI, could just accelerate our decline. But, you have faith in human nature here, James, and that is wonderful to see, I must say, coming from the cynic that is me these days. Hey, I know you've hired a lot of folks over your career into NASA, James, and you and I both have that journalism background. I'm curious, what do you look for, when you're hiring people in today? And has anybody ever scheduled an interview with you and then showed up and said, "Hey, I'm really just looking for a job"?
Yeah, I never had that happen. Right. Unfortunately, the world today doesn't really lend itself to that. I don't know that but somebody could have. I could have done that, and probably. I'm not a big fan of getting interviewed personally for stuff. So, but I could end up doing that, but it didn't ever happen. I will
Yeah.
say I always told that story to interns and stuff while I was at NASA, and they always found it interesting, and they all said that it's not available in today's world of hiring to go stick your. But I would tell them electronically then, however, there's always going to be some way to stick your foot in the door.
Yeah.
And I don't think you really get punished for sticking your foot in the door. If you stick it in correctly, you want to show, you got to be assertive. But hiring, to me, I will say, so just to sum up my thing too, is that probably the first half of my 38 years at NASA, I was a public affairs person, largely supporting shuttle, but other areas too, but off and on shuttle a lot. And then space station. I did support station as it did its first launch to orbit and started being built. But then the last half of my career, I was in management, right? Ending as the lead manager at JSC for communications office, director of communications. But I didn't really want to go into management. And this goes back to that small paper there, Tom, is that, I started out as a reporter there as you did. And then you left as a reporter and went to a bigger paper. And reporter, you get sent to go to the Houston Oilers games. I got to go sail on the Alyssa, not as a sailor, but just as sailing on it. I got to go do cool stuff, right?
Yeah.
That was cool. But then you get moved up to managing editor. Then you sit at the desk and you read the stories that other people who do cool stuff get to write, and you make a little more money, but it may not really work. So management, I'd already soured on it way early, so I didn't necessarily want to go into it, but I ended up going into it because I just kind of got pushed into that. So I found though that the most enjoyable thing about management to me was leading people, right? And key to that is hiring folks. And hiring, I don't think there's a more critical job that a leader does than hiring people for their team, because a bad hire can really destroy your team and good hires build your team. And you have very little information to go on to make that decision. No matter how intensive you make your hiring process, it's still a glimpse of information to make a very critical decision. To me, the most important things about folks in hiring, actually, the most important thing for me on hiring people was their teamwork ability. Can they be a good team player? Because that's critical, right? A bad team player is really somebody that can hurt the team, and everything at NASA, everything we did was total teamwork, right? I talk about me being on console during Columbia and me doing the talking points, but I was the tip of an iceberg of people that were everywhere, right? There were, for me being on console, there's more people that were in the newsroom and in other centers at Kennedy doing things everywhere, and working those press conferences. So everything is a huge team effort. Nothing happens without the team. If you can't be a team player, you're not going to work out.
Yeah.
Secondly, yes, print. I was biased to print. I never did broadcast until I got to NASA. Then I broadcasted for hundreds and maybe thousands of hours, right, in mission control. So I became broadcasting, but I did print at first. And this is pretty subjective, but I do feel that ability to write is a critical function to allow you to do almost anything in communications, right? And maybe it's not the ability to write. It's, for me, communications, I loved everything about it. I loved going in to interview somebody. That's the first part of writing, right? Or broadcasting or anything, right? I loved asking them the questions. Every person is a story. I agree with that tenet. So that passion for communications, the desire to want to tell those stories, print to me is and the ability to take complex subjects and boil them down to very simple terms that engage people, that get them to understand. That crosses all those platforms we talk about: social media, broadcast, multimedia, print. That's a basic skill for all of them. I can judge I feel like I can judge whether someone has that skill set better from their print work than other areas. That's probably biased on my background. So that's important. I would also, though, ask more general things with them, is just why did they decide on communications? Nobody ever gave me an answer that I decided to pursue communications as a career for the money. That's one answer I never got. But if they have a passion for it, if they have wanted to if they were to tell me they love interviewing people, they love figuring out how to fill that blank page, that's gonna get me excited about
a curious nature, right?
Yes, and that they feel like communications is important, and those things. So it's those were key things, right? That passion for communications, ability to communicate, and I judged it mostly by print, is a lot of the skill sets on that. Although I hired many broadcasters too who are just as skilled, and so I can look at both, right? Broadcast is a little tougher to tell because they have less time to explain something, so actually it can be more skill required, I think, than print at times to do it accurately. And then teamwork critical, and then one of the questions that I loved to ask, and we would ask always, is this was a telling thing maybe on teamwork and just on a lot of things, is I would ask people to tell me about something they I don't remember the exact wording of it, but we would basically ask them, tell me about something you failed at. Tell me about a bad thing that you did at work that was a real problem and what you learned from it. And so many people are just like a deer in the headlights when you ask them that. They never wanted to say that. But, to me, to hear somebody be forthright with that, because nobody's perfect. Everybody's had something bad, is a good telling of their nature and how they're going to.
And that's going to do it for this episode of the Leading in a Crisis podcast. Thanks for being with us. And again, if you want to drop me an email, that's tom@leadinginacrisis.com. And we'll see you again soon for another episode. Take care.